When I was running with the Concordia University cross-country team, our coach John would always say, you can only be good at 3 things in life: work or school, family was the second thing, and one more thing of your choice. He would go on to say that we can choose for that last thing to be running if we wanted to be a better runner. This saying usually appeared in our first team meeting at the beginning of cross-country season, and when we were getting ready for a new year after the holidays. It was meant to make us reflect on how we're using our time and if we're setting ourselves up for success in running or just spreading ourselves too thin. Because, students feel expected to do a lot of other things to prepare for eventual careers in their field of study. I heard this speech several times, but never from anyone other than John. This is until I read about Coach Jumbo Elliott in today's book. Hi, and welcome to Running Book Reviews podcast, where we review books written for runners, about runners, and by runners to help you decide if you would like to read the book for yourself. We also hope that listening to us chat about running can help keep you motivated about your own running or maybe inspire you to try something new. My name is Liz, and with my co-host Alan, we're going to talk with author Jerry Bouma about his book, The Villanova Track Story.
The Villanova Track Story is the story of Villanova University's dominance of the DMR, the distance medley relay, at the Penn Relays from 1966 all the way through to 1981. The book features this piece of running history, the athletes involved, and the circumstances that brought it all together. The author, Jerry Bouma, was himself a scholarship athlete from 1970 to 1974, but he tells the story by piecing together information gathered from many people who were present during a more than 16-year span. So let me tell you a bit more about Jerry. Jerry Bouma grew up on a family dairy farm in Owen Sound, Ontario, Canada, another great Canadian, and was the first Canadian to receive a track scholarship to Villanova University. After graduating from Villanova with a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics, he went on to earn a master's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Guelph, has spent his professional career in the agriculture and food industry, and currently lives in the province of Alberta, Canada. Jerry started off his running career before joining Villanova as a self-coached athlete and was the holder of several under-18 Canadian records in the 800 meters, 1500 meters, and mile events. In 1976, after graduating from Villanova, Jerry continued running at a high level and was 6th in the Canadian Olympic trials 1500 meters in a time of 3 minutes 44.8. He has not only represented Canada internationally as a runner, but has contributed to the track and field community and helped organize large-scale athletic events in Canada, such as the 2001 Legends of Gold Gala, the 2015 Pan American Junior Championships, the 2016 Canadian Athletics Olympic Trials. And as an author, this is not his first writing venture. Jerry has also done technical writing and has previously published 3 poetry books. Oof, with a big intake of breath after all of that. Welcome, Jerry.
Hello, Alan. Hello, Liz. Great to be with you.
Makes me want to live in Alberta so we could go to some of these things that you organize.
So, as usual, our first question about the book is sort of how and when did you decide to do this book?
Well, it's been on my mind for quite some time. And the reason I wrote it, finally I got to the point where I've got the time and I've got the motivation to actually write it. And I wrote it for 3 reasons. First, it's a great story to really focus in on a time period where one school could be so dominant in the middle distances for such an extended period of time. And if you think about it, 16 years in this case, where Villanova won the distance medley relay every year at the Penn Relays, that meant there was at least 5 complete turnover of athletes, because no athlete stayed longer or competed longer than 3 years. Typically, freshman year, initially you couldn't compete because there was basically a prohibition on freshmen competing in varsity athletes. That changed in the 70s, but certainly in the 60s, you couldn't compete as a freshman. So you had 3 years. And so if you look at the 15-year period or 16-year period, you had 5 complete turnovers. So how does that happen in terms of that sort of sustained high-level performance? Because through that period of time, we had several athletes on our teams that were typically ranked number 1 in the world for the mile, the 880, the 1500 meters, and that happened repeatedly. Secondly, I wanted to draw attention that from a sports point of view, and if you look at streaks, and we know, and you're Montreal, the home of the Montreal Canadiens, who won 5 Stanley Cups in a row, and the New York Yankees, who won
Yeah.
5 World Series in a row, and they did that twice. The Boston Celtics won, I believe, 7 or 8 NBA championships in a row. But to look at a streak of 16 consecutive wins is really unheard of. And I don't think there's anything that parallels that. So I wanted to really draw attention to that. And secondly, I wanted to really tell the inside story. And finally, I guess the third reason, I went to Villanova, and as you pointed out, I had great success as a 17-year-old. I was the Canadian record holder for the mile. I ran 4:09 as a 17-year-old, self-coached, and had every promise of being the next great miler. And I wanted to go to where the great milers were. And the number one guy in the world at the time was Marty LaCour, and he was at Villanova. So I said, that's where I want to go. And so I connected with the school and was fortunate enough to be offered a scholarship. I ran into some injury problems my second year, and really, for all intents and purposes, didn't really get going again till my fourth year. So I didn't have the career that I'd hoped. And so I always felt that my potential wasn't realized. I didn't give back to the school what I wanted to be able to do as an athlete. And I thought, here's a way of contributing to the history and the sport and the team by telling the story that had never really been told, which a lot of people in track and Eastern US are aware of, but no one's ever sat down and said, okay, what really happened? How did it happen? Who made it happen? Why did it happen? And so I took it upon myself to address those questions.
That's great. I think like before we get into all the details about the book itself, maybe you can tell us where Villanova is, and also maybe just like the Pennsylvania Relays. They're kind of a special event, but maybe you can
Right.
just like talk about that a
Sure.
bit, just so that you can highlight how it's a
Sure.
competitive event. It's not just any old race that you guys
Right.
streaked for 16
Right.
years. Yeah.
Right. Well, first of all, Villanova is located just about 10 miles west of Philadelphia. It's located in an area that's called the Main Line. And it's this really interesting topographical and geographical area. It's sort of in this rough kind of area that with a lot of woods, streams, and windy roads and sharp hills. And when the train line was first built from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, that was called the Main Line. It was built probably in the 1850s. And it was just far enough out of the city that the first well-to-do Americans, industrialists, would build estates. They would live in the city, but they would build these estates just west of the city. And it attracted a very posh style of both architecture and wealthy individuals. And Villanova is right in the middle of all this. And so it's a beautiful area in terms of both the vegetation, the roads. There are roads there where actually streams would actually run across the road. They wouldn't have culverts; they'd have streams running across the road. You'd have trees literally growing right to the edge of the road. You have these incredible walled estates with families like the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, the Hyers. And for me, coming from rural Ontario with rectangular roads and everything structured and ordered, and coming from a rural, small community, it was a huge culture shock for me to go from this rural environment to this upper middle class environment. Now, it was started by the Augustinians, Catholic school. It was quiet enclave, beautifully built buildings. It had this wonderful ambience. And it was sort of like this bubble in that very opulent neighborhood. Now, the Pennsylvania Relays itself, it started in 1895, the year before the first modern Olympics, 1896. It's the oldest track meet in the U.S., and it was very much committed. Its mission was to bring the best of the best to Philadelphia initially for a day or two, but now it's like a 4 or 5 day event. And it would bring the best universities, the best colleges, the best high schools, and they would run virtually nothing but relays. So every relay you can imagine, the 4x100 meters, the 4x200 meters, the 4x400 meters, the sprint medley, the distance medley, the 4x800, the 4x1500, the shuttle hurdles, which no one's ever seen, which hurdle race going back and forth up the track. And there's literally thousands of races the way it developed. And for the championship, they would develop a series called the Championships of America, where they would invite the best schools to compete in 5 or 6 key races. The 5 or 6 key races were the 4x1 mile or the 4x1500, the distance medley, the 4x800, the 4x400, the 4x100, and the 4x200. Those were the Championships of America relay races. And so this is where the best would gather. And things have changed somewhat since my era, because other relay meets have developed, such as the Texas Relays or the Drake Relays or the Mount Sac Relays. But for a longest period of time, the Penn Relays were the epitome of racing and of relay. It was called a relay carnival. It's set in this interesting structure that was probably built well over 100 years ago. It's called Franklin Field. Ben Franklin was the founder of University of Pennsylvania. The Franklin Field has this old Roman Colosseum architectural style to it, with the archways and the tiers and the ivy growing up the side of the building. And it has this incredible street activity that's taking place during the whole time the races are on. So there's all this street life, all this activity going on. Thousands of people coming to the relays, and there would be on the feature races, which would be Friday afternoon and Saturday afternoon, you'd have anywhere from 30 to 50,000 people in the stands.
Oh, wow.
So
That's
it became sort of like the Olympics. And for our coach, Jumbo Elliott, who we referred to earlier, he grew up not too far from the Penn Relays in a rather poor neighborhood. And his aspiration as a young kid was to run in the Penn Relays. And he decided this was his showcase. And that's why he would gear his teams to perform well at Penn Relays. And Villanova has had an incredible history at Penn Relays over the years.
You talked about a whole series of different teams that have performed, but Jumbo Elliott seems to be the thread that goes all the way through. That's and right. Connects, and from a coach point of view. Because reading the book, he seems to be aloof from the runners, right, sort of talking through people. So he assumes a sort of almost mythical type of legendary, mysterious sort of flavor in the book. So tell us a bit about Jumbo, where he came from, and how did you gather the information about him?
Well, Jumbo was all the things you've just described, Alan. He grew up in a fairly poor neighborhood outside of, not too far from Villanova, but in West Philadelphia. His father died young. He obviously took a role in supporting his mother, hard worker, and he showed some athletic ability. He was fast. And so in about 1932, he was actually offered one of the first athletic scholarships to Villanova. He was a Catholic kid. Villanova was Catholic school, and he was given the opportunity to go to Villanova, which he could never have afforded. When he was there, he actually, after his second or third year, there was a need for a change in coaching, and he actually became the coach. He was a coach athlete. And so he developed into be a pretty good 400-meter runner himself, and was one of the top 400-meter runners in the country, but didn't make the Olympics in 1936, the one that Jesse Owens became so well known for. So Jumbo was competing at Villanova at the same time Jesse Owens was at Ohio State. After the war, he got involved in sales, and he got somehow connected with a company that was selling heavy equipment, earth movers, bulldozers, and it so happened that the Eisenhower era was very much focused on building the interstate, and there was a lot of activity in building that type of infrastructure, and he was in the right place at the right time, and ended up being very successful in terms of selling a lot of equipment to construction companies that were doing just that. And so he ended up being very well-to-do and buying one of those estates that I talked about earlier, not too far from Villanova, in a place called Upper Merion. Meanwhile, he continued to coach. And during the 50s, he had unexpected success in a sense. He recruited through a couple of his athletes that had made the 1952 Olympic team, an athlete from Ireland by the name of Ron Delaney. And Ron was he was a good athlete, but nothing special. But Ron came to the U.S. and he ended up becoming a very good 1500-meter runner. He wins the Olympic gold medal in 1956. And very shortly thereafter, one of Jumbo's 400-meter runners, Charlie Jenkins, wins the 400 meters. So here we have, and then Charlie goes on to win the 4x400. So here you have the small school suddenly having 3 gold medals from the Olympic Games. That kind of put Villanova on the map. And so from that point on, Villanova was a target. People knew the school. The better runners wanted to go there. And Jumbo really, he never left his job as a business person and became a partner in his company. Coaching for him was a hobby, and he would drop in at the school on his way home, basically 3:30, 4 o'clock. Jumbo would drop in,
which coincided with your workouts. You guys would be all
Right,
warmed up,
right.
and
Well,
he would just show
It's
up.
kind of hard to imagine these days with like full-time coaching
not at all.
teams and stuff.
The antithesis of what you expect
Yeah.
a coach to be omnipresent there all the time, and that was Jumbo was the complete opposite of that. We would see him in early September when we all came back, and he'd have the speech. You can do 3 things. You've got your academic life, you got your athletic life, and you got your social life, and you only can do 2. So you better figure it out real fast what 2 you're going to focus in on. And if you don't get your grades, I don't even want to see you here. So he kept a sharp eye on how well his athletes did in school. And if you weren't getting grades, he didn't want to see you. So he'd had a bit of a stutter, and he would say, "Get your goddamn ass to the library." So we would see him once a week in September. And all he would say is, "Put in the miles, nice and easy. It's like putting money in the bank." And he just expected his runners to go out and put the miles. Now, the key, he'd always have 1 or 2 athletes there that were already through their own development or had been recruited who was a top class athlete. And that athlete would influence the culture and the work ethic of the team.
Kind of a role model.
Exactly. And so in a sense, the whole period, starting with Ron Delaney, and then it was Noel Carroll from Ireland, then it was the first chapter or the first main protagonist in my book is Dave Patrick. Dave came as a 4:11 or 4:12 mile in high school and very quickly developed to become a 4-minute miler. And he set the world indoor record for the 880 yards, beating Jim Ryan, who was at that time the world record holder for the mile. He became the man, if you will, and he established a work ethic and a commitment that really influenced the whole period, which I was part of. It went then to Marty LaQuarrie, who was one of the first high school athletes to break 4 minutes. He was actually the 3rd in 1967. Then it moved to my roommate and close friend, John Hartnett, who was an Irishman. Then it moved to Eamon Coughlin, who was another Irishman from Dublin, who then became ultimately world famous because he became the world indoor record holder for the mile and won the world championship 5,000 meters in Helsinki. And Eamon had an incredible career. Then it moved to Don Page, who became number 1 in the world in 1980 for the 800 meters. He beat Sebastian Coe after the Olympics, and Track and Field News ranked him number 1. And then it moved to Sidney Marie, South African runner, first Black South African to come to the U.S. on a scholarship, and he became a top-class runner. And one of his NCAA records was just beaten like a couple of years ago. That's how long that's lasted. So this whole period of time, you had this kind of culture that was passed on from person to person, from team to team, through osmosis and example. And through all this, Jumbo would be there once a week. And then during cross country, we would do a workout on Tuesdays, 20 times 400 on the track. That's when Jumbo would show up. We'd be ready to go. And then we'd see him on the weekends when we raced. Then come November, December, wouldn't see him again. And wouldn't see him again till the 2nd of January. We'd come back and get ready for indoors. And we had this famous board track. We were the only school that had this 160-yard board track set up outside.
Outside. It wasn't even inside. It was outside.
No, it was outside on the football field. It was always lots of snow on there. You know how much snow you get in Montreal. It's not that bad in Philadelphia, but you do get snow. And it's cold and it's windy. And we would do 3 workouts a week on the track: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays, usually rest Friday, Thursday, race Friday or Saturday. So that we'd see Jumbo. He'd roll up in his Cadillac, 3:30, 3:45. He expected us to be warmed up, ready to go. and we would start doing our workouts. And then he would leave. Didn't really hang around. He didn't get chum up to. He had a few favorites he'd talk to. He usually talked to the leaders, one or two people, say this is the workout, and the rest would just follow. So I think one of the reasons why Villanova was successful as long as it was is that Jumbo, he created that kind of what I call creative tension, the way he interacted with the team. Secondly, and probably the most important thing that he did, he knew what kind of athlete to recruit.
Yeah, so I'm happy that you're mentioning that because, you know, like in the list of athletes that you mentioned, they don't all come into Villanova being like 4-minute milers, but they all develop into sub 4-minute milers. So what did he look for?
He looked, first of all, what kind of family did they come from? He typically would attract athletes from working class, hardworking families. He would always ask about the family, what they're doing, how they're doing. So let's say working class families. He would pick an athlete that physically was slender. He didn't like thick or muscular builds. He liked slender athletes, and he liked athletes that were typically good at the 800 or the 1500 meters, who were versatile, and not people who just could run long distances or not pure sprinters. He'd like that middle distance 1500 mix. And he'd like athletes that were humble, that carried themselves, that were respectful. And you put those type of athletes together and you create the kind of culture that was very much part and parcel of the Villanova team culture for all those years. And it still hangs together. We still get together on a regular basis here 40, 50 years later.
Where did the tension come from? You talked about he created a certain tension.
Because he wasn't there, there was an inherent desire to make sure you could perform or you pleased him, because you didn't see much of him.
Yeah.
So when you saw him, you wanted
better
to
not mess up.
Actually, please him.
Yeah.
And he could get the best out of his athletes that way, because he wasn't really trying to babysit them. In fact, quite the opposite. He wasn't trying to soothe them or pat them on the back. And so the point I don't think I really made was that because of this sort of distance and the fact that you as an athlete had to decide you were having to take responsibility for your own development in large part, it created a stronger athlete than someone who needed a lot of support and baby. And so I think if you look at the character of the athletes, the Dave Patricks, the LaCourys, the Coughlin's, the Hartnetts, very strong, independent-minded, not afraid to take things on, because they basically had to do that just to survive and to thrive under the Jumbo era. Now, there was another really important juxtaposition to that. That's Mother Pyra, the assistant coach. Now, he wasn't really a coach. And as one of my very close friends and one of the athletes I just referred to, John Hartnett from County Cork, would say, well, we didn't call him Mother for nothing, because all the niggly details of day-to-day life, classes, losing stuff, needing new shoes, I need some money for some food because I haven't got enough in the cafeteria, or all those personal stuff. Mother Pyra would be the guy that looked after that. So that was a very important part of the mix. So you had this really clear, distant sort of father figure, Jumbo, and then you had the nurturing, look after the details and all the dirty laundry stuff that is part and parcel of any group that Mother Pyra would, and he would be on campus all the time because he was sort of paid from several different avenues. He got a bit of money for being an assistant coach, but he was on the security service, so he watched for parking violations, and then he would guard the cafeteria to keep people from sneaking in the side door. So he was kind of everywhere all the time. But fundamentally, he had an incredible memory for detail, and he was the guy that often, getting back to Penn Relays, he would be watching all the high school races and picking out the type of athlete that he thought would be best to come to Villanova. So he did a lot of the pre-screening that Jumbo only had to make the final decision on. So he played a really, really important role.
But also, back in the day without internet and all that sort of stuff, it must have been pretty stressful for some of the, athletes. What they are is good runners. They don't necessarily have a background that they would be easily able to sort of absorb this big, huge university, and it's new and American because some of them were Irish coming over and
Right.
for different places. It must have been quite intimidating and quite difficult, sort of psychologically or emotionally for them.
Well, that's a good point, Alan. And if I think on what you're saying, reflect upon what you're saying. First of all, Villanova was quite a small school. It wasn't like a big state school. And
Okay.
one of the schools I visited, the first place that actually offered me a scholarship was the University of Michigan. And I remember traveling down to Ann Arbor, and I just had this uneasy feeling. It was big. It seemed impersonal, and
Yeah.
I thought, gee, I don't think I want to go there. Villanova was quite different. It was small. It was more closeted, if you will. It had this sort of this feel and this
More
architecture that
homely,
kept it
maybe.
together. Yeah.
But do you think some of that was maybe Mother Pyra? Because it seems like he would sort of create relationships between people because, you'd go talk to him and he'd be like, oh, I think you and this person would really get along. And it seemed like he would,
Well,
get people together.
he would actually he knew who the leaders were on the team, and he knew who could look after what issue on a personal level at the team level.
Mhm.
And like a good example, Liz, the second Canadian on scholarship was an athlete by the name of Ed Takis, Hungarian. So not too far from his parents are Hungarian immigrants, and your parents are Czech immigrants, and working class background from Brantford, Ontario. And he was one of these kids that just had a lot of raw talent. Didn't train all that hard, but he's one of these kids who could just run a hell of an 800 meters. Like he won All Ontario High School. And I laughed when I met him because he told me about his experience, and he had to borrow a pair of spikes that were 2 sizes too big. And that's just the kind of, he never really worried about it and never really was prepared enough or serious enough to even buy a proper pair of spikes that fit his feet. He just borrowed some of the spikes and go off and runs the best 800 meters in Ontario. He ends up coming to Villanova, and we became very close friends. And during that first year, I remember coming. It was toward the end of the year. It was April, and I'm sitting in the cafeteria having breakfast, and I'm the co-captain with John Hartnett. So John was the man. He was the number one miler in America at the time, and I was the co-captain. I was a good runner, but I wasn't one of the best. But we kind of looked after the team. John showed how to the merits of hard work and running well, and I had more of an interpersonal approach. Just worked hard as well, so I looked after people more of an interpersonal way. But one morning I'm sitting having breakfast, and all of a sudden I see Mr. Pyra and Ed walking my way, and I could tell something had happened. Well, sure enough, Ed's mother had just passed away.
Oh.
She had cancer, and then we knew she wasn't well, but this came as a surprise. Ed was devastated, of course. So Mr. Pyra knew right away, have him spend some time with Jerry. So Ed comes and we spent I got the news, then we left the cafeteria and we walked around campus. We sat under a tree, we chatted, we just talked about life, we just talked about our families. We just talked about what brought us to Villanova. He was from working class background in Brantford. I came from a fairly modest farm background in Owen Sound. We're about 3 hours apart, so we could relate to each other. And then Ed up and left and went home to his mother's funeral. So here, all these years later, about 3 years ago, I'm at Villanova with Ed, and he says, Jerry, I want to take a picture. I want to take a picture. And he says, I said, where? He said, I want to go here. I want to go here. I said, where do you want to go? He went to the tree under which we sat when we talked about his mother and his mother's funeral all those years ago.
So he remembered it even up to today.
That was very meaningful to him. And so that was an example of the kind of interaction. And I think what you've already picked up on, the culture of us looking at, first of all, having usually a world leader amongst us, and then that culture of looking after each other and looking out for each other because you had no choice, really was a defining dynamic at the school and amongst the team.
It seemed like the team, I mean, you guys were on scholarship, and it seemed like you kind of got looked after as athletes as well, because you mentioned in the book that you guys got like meal tickets because
That's
you
right.
would have, I guess you guys, the whole team, if they were on scholarship, they were coming from modest backgrounds, so they didn't have extra money that their parents were sending them. So
right.
You get these little meal tickets.
That's right. We would have tickets for what we would call the fourth meal. Like we had obviously breakfast, lunch, and and dinner. And quite frankly, we were running 110 miles a week. We were starving. We were
Mm-hmm.
skinny kids starving. And then, but at 8:30 every night, and this was an important part of the team culture, we'd go to this place on campus. It was called the Pie Shop. And we were given tickets, and they were worth back then, 15 cents a piece. So we got maybe 30 a week. And so we could use those to buy a hamburger or a milkshake. And back then, 3 or 4 pie shops, you could get almost a meal. So, but every night at 8:30, this place would be really quiet. And all of a sudden, 20 guys from all different directions would arrive at the pie shop. It was the track guys. The fourth meal, and we would gather and commiserate and give each other a hard time. And there would be laughter and jocularity and bets and challenges and the kind of it was like a bunch of young lions going at each other. But that was part of the ritual, and it was a really important part of the culture because we really did hang together like a team. And that's not to say there weren't ups and downs, and it's not to say too that there weren't casualties. There were people that didn't make it. They would arrive, big expectations, but didn't have the emotional strength to really handle that kind of creative tension I talked about earlier, Alan. Who needed the handholding, needed the babysitting, couldn't handle the ribbing and the jocularity of the team, because you had to really be tough to stand up to it and give it right back. If you couldn't handle it, it became a challenge. And there were those that just didn't make it, and they would disappear. And but the ones that remained and survived were really tough. And you can see that in the type of athlete that Villanova produced for such a long period of time.
It became effectively a way of filtering people
Absolutely.
for mental approach or to mental toughness, I guess. Well, one of the things we saw in the book was one of the big East versus West rivalries.
Yeah,
seemed to be between Villanova and Oregon.
Oregon, that's right.
We then hear a little bit about the Oregon coach Bill Bouma, and they seem to be two very different people, James Jumbo Elliott and Bill Bouma. What were the differences? What were the main sort of things, counterpoints between those two teams and coaches?
Well, first of all, both had developed really outstanding middle distance programs. If you look at the 60s and 70s, and you look at most of the great American or European athletes, in the case of Ireland, trace a lot of them to either Villanova or Oregon, Olympic teams, etc. Now, I really grew to understand this, Alan, because I come from Ontario, went to school in the Eastern U.S., the establishment, if you will. And then I've spent the last 30 years in the West. And the spirit, and it's a little bit, you're from the north of England, so there's very different zeitgeist in the north of England compared to London.
You bet.
And the West is quite different, and it's the frontier spirit. People came out here, they basically had to make their own lives because there was, because of the conditions, and there was really no one here to pave the way. You had to make it. Oregon really represents that frontier spirit. And Bill Bouma comes out of that kind of frontier, rugged, don't tell us what to do and we can figure it out and we can be as good as anybody. So let's start with that versus the establishment, the East, the Ivy League schools, the well-to-do families, the kind of the culture, the political strength and momentum that you see of the Eastern establishment. So that's what Jumbo represented. Bouma represented this frontier, don't tell us what to do kind of mentality. They were, similar. And I often think, and to do a comparison of England, you had two great statesmen, but they were completely opposite. You had Bertrand Russell and Winston Churchill, and similar age, but totally different. I don't think they really had much to do with each other, if anything. And Jumbo and Bouma really didn't like each other either, for a number of reasons. First, they were competitors, and they both had very good middle distance teams. The rivalry really kind of came to a head in 1968 when the process of selecting the U.S. American Olympic team was, in fact, at play. Yeah. And the previous year, LaQuarrie, who had just broken 4 minutes for the mile in high school, so he's just turned 18. He was kind of interested in going to Oregon. He met with the two big runners in the U.S. at the time, Jim Grell and Daryl Burleson, who were on the Olympic team in '64, I believe, plus Jim Ryan. And so there was clearly a growing capability and reputation at Oregon. And LaQuarrie was sort of interested in going there. He's from New Jersey, and he visited the school. And Bouma basically told him, "Well, you better stick to the East. You're better off in the Eastern U.S. I don't think you're going to fit in here at all. And LaQuarrie kind of remembered that, and so then a year later, for the '68 Olympic trials, Bouma had 2 or 3 athletes that could have made the team, and Villanova had 2, Dave Patrick and Marty LaQuarrie. And so what happened is that LaQuarrie ended up finishing second. He makes the team, and Patrick finishes 4th, but he had won the first set of Olympic trials, and somehow Bouma engineered it so Patrick had been promised that he'd be on the team no matter what, because he'd won the first set of trials, and he was left off the team, and that left a real bitter taste. And that really was the root of the bitterness between Villanova and Oregon, is how Dave Patrick was handled in 1968. And during the 70s, I was a freshman. Our cross-country team beat Oregon by 1 point at the NCAA championships. Prefontaine won the race, and one of our runners was second. And then we just had better positioning to win the actual championships. But Bouma really didn't like the East. He didn't think much of indoor track. He wouldn't come to Penn Relays. And there was just this ongoing rivalry that kind of was mostly unspoken, but there was very different feelings and attitudes. And it was really epitomized in the difference in that kind of Eastern mentality that Jumbo represented, and that frontier Western mentality that Bouma represented.
And so what you're saying is Dave Patrick, who was a fantastic runner at the time, he didn't get selected for the Olympics because somebody pulled some strings behind the scenes.
That's right. That's what happened. And
I guess we don't know the real story, but
we don't really know the real story. Yeah. It's never come out, but Dave was absolutely devastated because he went into the second set of trials, having been told that because he'd won the first, he was the top 50-meter runner in the country at the time. And so because, and that was in late June of '68, and I think I tell the story in the book. Dave was Dave was my host when I was being recruited in 1970. And Dave and I continue to be very close friends because we have a lot of similarities in terms of just the way we see things. And it's become more evident as we've gotten older how similar we are. But Dave was the top miler in America in like June of 1968. He won the Olympic trials, the first set of trials. He was told, don't worry, you're on the team. We're going to have another set of trials in Lake Tahoe at altitude in September. But that's just to make sure that we're going to pick 2 more people, and we'll just make sure that everybody's got conditioning. So he trained through those trials. So he didn't rest.
Yeah.
And so he got out sprinted and finished 4th. And then he was told afterwards, too bad, we're picking the top 3 from that race, and you're not on the team. It actually was so devastating for him, Alan and Liz, that he never really recovered from it. He never ran again after that.
I was devastated for him when you told the story in the book. I mean, it just, yeah.
And interestingly, all these years later in 2008, 40 years after, there was a special ceremony in Philadelphia. I was en route to it to attend, and I got delayed in Minneapolis. Didn't make it in time. I got there later that evening. But the coach of the Olympic team in '68 by the name of Peyton Jordan, Marcus O'Sullivan, who was another one of the greats at Villanova, who's now the coach, had made an arrangement for Peyton to come to Philadelphia with a surprise party that was supposed to be honoring Larry James, one of our great 400-meter runners. But the real purpose of the evening was to officially induct Dave onto the '68 Olympic team. So he's now technically an Olympian.
Wow.
40 years after the fact. But when that happened, he just absolutely broke down, and it was a hugely emotional event for him. So that happened, and Bowerman was in the thick of really making sure, because he wanted, actually, I think one of the reasons why he had engineered to have that race, the top 3 of that second race, be the selection for the team, is that he had 2 athletes that he thought could be in those top 3. As it was, neither of them ran all that well, and neither of them made it. And it was Ryan LaQuarrie and Tom Van Ruden that was on that team. So,
well, I guess that's karma, right back at him. But
yeah, and I want to tell that story because Dave was so instrumental in setting the team culture, and you probably read also about how Villanova took a stand on the racial issue in '68, which was a big deal.
Yeah.
And they made the decision not to compete. New York Athletic Club at the time had a major meet in New York. New York always had the Melrose Games, but 2 weeks later would be the New York Athletic Club meet, which was a major indoor meet. And Villanova boycotted that meet in 1968 because New York Athletic Club had a very explicit policy of excluding Blacks and Jewish people from being members of the club. So it got to the point where the civil rights movement was developing, that they targeted that meet, said, okay, Black athletes are going to compete there. And Villanova had several really good Black athletes. And they and Jumbo said, you guys decide. And Dave was actually on that particular, that was happened in 68. Dave was on the cover of the program because he had broken 4 minutes the previous year. And so he was a feature guy.
Yeah.
And the week before the race, they Villanova boycotted. And suddenly that was the end of the New York Athletic Club meet. It continued in a different form. After that, it was called the Olympic Invitational. But the NYAC meet, it was done after that. And Villanova was the decision maker in not attending. And that really put an end to that meet.
I think we forget how much change there's been in our lifetimes, because, you know, I read this about New York Athletic Club had a policy of no Blacks and no Jews.
And very open about it, very explicit.
And I'm going, oh, wow, this is crazy.
Yeah.
But, you know, back in 68, it was a different world, I guess. Well, no, it was definitely a different world.
Yeah.
Also, Villanova, they took a team down into Tennessee and
right.
a couple of times as well during the period where Martin Luther King was assassinated. So the Black tensions.
There was a huge tension. This happened after the boycott they had engaged in at the New York meet in February. So this is now, I think, April. And Martin Luther King was shot early April, I believe. Yeah. And the dual meet between Tennessee and Villanova was like 5 days later, and the tensions were palatable. The Villanova team met and said, should we go or should we not? Some of the Black guys are getting kind of worried because they knew that they're entering good old boy country, and they were going to beat a lot of the Tennessee runners. And they went, and it was amazing dual meet in terms of the performances and the wins. And ironically, at the very end of that meet, Villanova was leading, and then somehow Tennessee came up with it. They produced an event that no one ever heard of, a heavy weight throw. And of course, they won that event. They got enough points to win the meet.
I could love it.
That's terrible. Like people just made up rules. It seems like if they had enough power, they could just make up rules and end up winning. Like happened with Dave Patrick and being kind of pushed out of the Olympic team, and then. Yeah. But I guess that was the way it was.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
You can't imagine that now. I mean, you know, I don't think in the time that I've been a runner that like I've heard of people experiencing things like that.
Well, you probably know enough about 68 and the famous 200 meters with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and one of the most iconic pictures that have endured from the modern era.
Black power.
John Carlos, we had one of our sprinters from the 60s, Paul Drayton, I think he was a bronze medalist in 1960. He passed away about 8 or 10 years ago, and there was a special ceremony at Penn Relays. A small group of us met. John Carlos came to that. I had a chance to say hello to him. But of course, he really suffered, and so did Tommy Smith, because of the stand he took. They were ostracized. They had a hard time getting jobs. They were basically cast out from the athletic community, as the business community, the social community, and it was really tough for them, for the stand that they took. Yeah,
it took a long time for passage of time for sort of history to be sort of rewritten or reviewed.
And I have to admit, one of my biggest shocks going to the U.S., being a naive, 17-year-old Canadian, and having read about the civil rights movement and having this belief that things were getting better down there, I could not believe the structural racism that I saw, how deeply embedded racism was, in fact, in the U.S. And in many respects, I don't know if it's changed all that much, but it was a real shock for me to see and hear, and to meet kids, actually white kids that had gone to Villanova, had never spoken to a Black person.
Yeah.
I said, can you imagine living in a society where there's Black people everywhere and you've never spoken to one? That tells you how systemic racism was.
I guess since we're on the topic of racism, in about 1977, 78,
Sydney
Marie was recruited from South Africa. And he was recruited, but it seemed like he never was really able, like, even though he stuck around in the end, but he didn't seem like he he mingled with the group the way that everybody else
Right.
did. And that was because you said in the book that he lived through the apartheid era in South
Right.
Africa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Apartheid. Yep.
Yeah. So like after the fact now, did you, do you ever, does he ever get together with you guys? Like, has anybody heard from him since university?
And the reason I told that story is that, and it's sort of a metaphor for, in some respects, for how I want to support the program in the future. So all my book sales, I'm going to donate back to Villanova, and specifically to support mental health on athletes, to help support people who are struggling, because that was clearly missing when I was there. The casualties I referred to, people not being able to cope and then quietly going away because there was no way of even, you couldn't, when you can consider the incredibly competitive environment we were part of, you can't show weakness. And so if you're struggling, if you've got depression or you've got doubts or you're starting to really wonder whether you're in the right place, who are you going to talk to? You're not going to talk to your fellow athletes who are out there giving you a hard time every chance they get, and then punishing you on the track or the roads. Let me go back to Sydney. In retrospect, and I did go into the history of apartheid and the irony of that history. And first of all, I have an enormous interest in history, so I had learned a lot about it just through my reading. And then I had the fortune of actually going to South Africa in '89, so I could see firsthand. This was when apartheid was still in full force, before Mandela was released, and I could see and get a feel for what was really going on there. And then it really, over the years, I realized how poorly equipped Villanova had been, and ourselves as either alumni or athletes, to really handle a person like Sydney, because he came to America as this promising Black athlete, and everybody assumed he was just another good Black athlete, just like you had in America. No idea what he'd come from. No idea that in South Africa, under apartheid, you as a Black person would not look a white person in the eye. You were totally subservient and beaten down. So here comes Sydney, and everybody assumed he's going to be he'd run like 3:57 as an 18-year-old. Like he was a sub 4-minute miler when he came. And there's a whole irony to the event that he ran and won and ran. That race was a celebration of the great Boer triumph over the Zulus in 1838, I believe it was. The Blood River Massacre and the Covenant and the triumph of the Boers over the local Blacks. And they had a special race, and Sydney Marie wins it, Black guy, and then he ends up with an opportunity to tour the U.S. because the South Africa was trying to show how open-minded it was by giving Black athletes this opportunity to tour America. And then he ended up in Philadelphia and ended up beating Jumbo Elliott and ended up getting a scholarship at Villanova. And ploof, he gets plunked into Villanova, and no one has a clue about his background. And the poor guy he must have been in shock. And I know he was in shock because I've talked to people who actually were his roommates or lived with him, and he was really had no idea what was expected of him, how he should behave, how the social society worked, what his role should be. And he just put his head down and just he did a lot of running on his own. And it was just through his tenacity and his talent that he was able to develop to become one of the top runners, not only in the U.S. college system, but if you go back, and Alan, you'll remember the great rivalry between Coe and Ovett.
Of course.
In between one of those races, Sydney Marie actually broke the world record. He snuck in there and broke the world record, and it lasted only for a few days, but it was when Ovett and Coe were trading. And Ovett, you'll see, I think in 81, I believe, or 82. That's the quality of runner that Sydney Marie was. So, and I wanted to tell that story just to give some context in terms of the challenges that a person like Sydney Marie had to really overcome that most people weren't aware of. And I also tell the Eamon Coughlin story. Eamon, who ended up becoming one of the best runners, the middle distance runners the world's ever seen, with great longevity. He set the world record for the indoor mile, and first of all in 1979, broke it again in 1981, and then broke it again in 83. He was the first to go under 3:50 for the mile indoors, and that stood until 97 when El Garouche, or 98, El Garouche broke it, and then it stood there for a long, long time until it was broken more recently. And today's track world is a whole different story again, but we may get to that. But Eamon comes as this precocious 18-year-old. Eamon and I are exactly the same age. He came a year behind me, and his first year was a disaster. he, he was a kid of Dublin. He was so homesick. He didn't fit in. He got injured. He got discouraged. He got depressed. And then suddenly, when the team is off to the indoor championships in Detroit, which he wasn't on that team, he goes home and never comes back. So we thought, well, we'll never see Eamon Goggin again. And somehow Jumbo saw something in Eamon, that this kid had potential, and Eamon got a second chance. And when he came back the second time, he got serious. We kind of, John Hartnett and I, who were the co-captains of the team at the time, always kind of made sure we kept an eye on Eamon. He settled in, and within a year, he really started to show his ability. And by 1976, his last year at Villanova, he was unbeatable. There doesn't matter what other athletes threw at him, he could beat them. He could beat you in a sprint. He could beat you in a long finish. He could beat you front running. He had such talent, and he had great confidence. He ran in the feature mile that Filbert Bayi from Tanzania broke the long-standing world record,
that's the Dream Mile in 1975 in Jamaica.
Exactly. If you look at that race,
we spoke to Filbert Bayi about it, actually. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's and on the cover of Sports Illustrated, Bayi is a front runner, and he's leading, and then with a lap to go, Eamon passes him, and Bayi looks at him and sort of says, "What the hell are you doing here?" And then takes off again, and then Bayi breaks the world record. LaQuarrie was second, and Eamon was third, and that put Eamon on the map. And so Eamon became one of the favorites to win, actually to compete for the gold in '76 against John Walker
in Montreal.
And I tell that story. And I said, Eamon went into that race, the man of two voices, the voice of Jumbo and the voice of his Irish coach, Jerry Farnham. Jumbo was kind of worried that there's some fast finishers in that race. Walker being one, Ivan Van Dam being another, Rick Walhalter being another, all really great 800-meter runners. And when the pace was slow, the first lap, Eamon heard Jumbo's voice and said, "Oh shit, I better get up there and take the lead." So he ends up leading the race for the next 2.5 laps. And then he gets out kicked, and he finishes fourth. If Eamon had stuck to his guns and just kicked with Walker or Van Dam, he might very well have won that race, because he was a good kicker. Because I talked to Eamon again not too long ago, and he says, of all the races Walker and I ran against each other, I won more of them than he, and a lot of them came down to the kick. And that's one of Eamon's biggest regrets, is that he finished fourth in the '76 Olympics in Montreal. And then in 1980, he finished fourth again in the 5,000 meters. So he's got 2 fourth-place finishes.
Damn.
But in between, he was completely dominant, won everything. Yeah. Just at the Olympics didn't come together.
And then he won the first World Championships in '83 in Helsinki. The first time everybody got together again as the world, because '76 we had the Africans boycott. 1980 we had the Americans and the Western world boycott at Moscow. So '83 was the first time everybody was together. And he wins the 5,000 meters, and he wins it easily, handily.
Wow.
If I read rightly, in your book, there was a subsequent investigation about doping violations or something, which could have led to Eamon being awarded a medal.
That's right.
I went and searched this everywhere in Google and couldn't find anything. I guess because nothing came of it officially.
That's right.
What was the story behind that?
The Finlander, is it Manica, who came second in that race.
But which race are we talking about now?
The 5,000.
Okay.
Admitted sometime thereafter that he'd been doping. He actually, from what I heard, threw his medals into a lake.
Okay. Disgusted with himself.
I'd heard about that, and I actually took the lead in trying to convince the Irish Olympic Committee to make a case. And I met the Minister of Sport in Ireland in 2013. And he was a good guy, and I said, how do we move this forward? And the problem with Eamon is that he's a very strong-willed, and he speaks his mind. And there was a guy, and you probably heard of him, the guy, Pat Hickey, who was the head of the Irish Olympic Committee, and he was one of these typical bureaucrat guys who gets into position, and then he will never let go. and he hates anyone who challenges him. He was a guy that was caught scalping tickets in Rio de Janeiro, if you remember. Same guy. That shows you a bit about his moral fiber. There was no way he was going to support Eamon. He didn't like Eamon, and Eamon didn't like him, and it never went past that.
That's too bad.
So if your own Olympic committee won't support you in something like that, then it can't. Then no one else is going to do it. And that's where it stalled.
Oh, that's too bad.
Okay, if Eamon Coughlin is listening to our podcast when it publishes, Eamon, we think you are an Olympic medalist. We don't care what the record books say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in retrospect, those two fourth place finishes aside, Eamon is one of the most accomplished and consistent and arguably brilliant middle distance runners that we've seen. His competitive ability, particularly indoors, is just outstanding. He loved, and that's where the boards comes in, because when we train in this what seemed to be this silly little soup bowl on the field with the snow blowing off it, you would have thought, how in the hell is this going to be good for anybody? Well, it did a couple things. It made us tough. And secondly, we learned how to run the boards. And then people like Eamon, who had the physique, he could feel right away, this is, I can really excel at this. He knew right away that this was a place where he could excel. And sure enough, if you look at the history of indoor track from, let's say, 74 to the mid 80s, there's one dominant character from the mile, and that's Eamon Coughlin.
So those boards, that, because you mention them a lot in the book, because that was your training venue all winter, and that was the training venue for all the athletes in the whole streak.
That era.
So it was a track made out of like wooden boards that you guys ran on in the winter,
like an indoor track, but outside.
When there was snow on it, maybe potentially.
Yeah, and the snow would have to be shoveled off first, and sometimes we'd have to do it. But it was supposed to be done by the landscape guys. The maintenance staff were supposed to make sure the boards were clean, but you could be sure that was a low priority.
Yeah, well, track and field facilities usually are a low priority. Like that's just the way our sport is. But so also, like, this was outside. I mean, was it slippery? Did you guys wear your spikes on the boards in the winter?
We wore spikes. We wore spikes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it sounded like kind of a hardcore thing to do. I mean, I was just freezing thinking about you guys running in the winter on the boards in the snow and like in the wind, and trying to do 400s or 800 repeats or whatever you had to do. Oh, it sounded actually, you said it was 3-lap repeats, I think.
Three lappers, yeah. So the boards are 160 yards, so 11 times 160 is 760. That's the mile. So 3 lappers is 480 yards. 2 lappers are 320 yards. So 480 is slightly over longer than a 440 or a quarter. And so that became the most common repeat that we would do.
Actually, another thing you talk about a lot in the book, because that's the main theme, that's where the streak happened, is the distance medley relay. Maybe can you just touch a little bit on, like, why was this relay special? Because you mentioned a whole bunch of relays that happened at the Penn Relays, like the 4x1 mile, 4x1500, all those other relays, the 4x400, which is kind of more common. But this distance medley relay, it seemed like this is sort of the prime event.
Well, it was one which was the streak, where Villanova was unbeaten. So it stood out for the 16 years. But during that 16-year period, Villanova won a total of 52 relays. So and the guys typically that ran the distance medley, 3 of them would be running 2 or 3 other races: the 4x half, or 4x800, or the 4x mile. And there were 4 years during that period we won all 5 major championships of America. We won the distance medley, the 4x mile, the 4x half mile, the sprint medley, and the 4x4.
Yeah, I think you refer to it in the book as the 5-peat.
Yes, that's right. And that's never been done. It was never done before, and it's never been done after.
Yeah, but Villanova have done it 4 times.
Distance medley, I think, epitomizes the inherent flexibility and strength of the Villanova track team, because it has 4 distinct distances in order of the running. Typically, the first leg is the 3/4, 3 laps, then the 1 lap, then the 2 laps, the 800, and then the mile, 4 laps. And so you need 3 really good middle distance runners. You need a really good 3-lapper, which is a 3/4 mile, which is like a mile. You need a really good half mile. You need a good miler, and then you need a good quarter miler. You could have a weak quarter miler and usually still win the race if you've got 3 strong runners on the other legs. But that was the essence of the Villanova Track Program. We had such depth middle distance running that we could put those 3 players plus the quarter miler together year after year after year. And typically we always had a great miler anchoring the team. So you had Dave Patrick, who was world-class miler, Marty Corey, a world-class miler. You had John Hartnett, a world-class miler, Eamon Coglan as a world-class miler, Don Page as a world-class miler, and then finally Sidney Marie, all world-class milers as anchors.
And then these guys would go on, like that was the first day of racing,
Right,
and these
right,
guys
right. would
go on and they would probably run like 2 or 3 other events over
That's
the
right.
weekend. Also winning a lot of the times from what.
Right.
Yeah.
In many cases, winning. Although some athletes like Mark Belger never lost a race at Penn Relays. Marty
That's
LaCour, I don't think
amazing.
ever lost a race at Penn Relays. John Hartnett, I don't think ever lost a race. Same with Eamon Coglan.
Wow.
Never lost a race.
The streak's absolutely bonkers. I mean, 16 years.
That's a long
and
time.
all of the personnel changes. But I guess all streaks break. And in 1982, the streak ended.
Right.
And I guess probably significantly, Coach Elliott had died the year before. Was that the decisive factor, basically?
Absolutely. His spirit, if you will, extended 4 weeks later. He died at the end of March. His spirit extended for another 4 weeks, and Villanova won the distance medley again in 1981. But a full year later, that spirit had dissipated, and quite frankly, in my view, the choice of the anchor, putting the pressure on one person who was a good miler, but he'd never ever run anchored for Villanova before. He was a transfer student. And the pressure he was under was enormous. He shouldn't have been anchoring. There was another fellow who ran the 3/4 who was quite experienced, and I think he could have won that race, and we could have extended that streak for another few more years, quite frankly. But sooner or later it was going to end. 16 is still a good streak and made for a good story.
Mm-hmm. So, you go into great detail about the athletes and the dynamic of the different like eras of the athletes for 16 years. But obviously, you were only a student there for 4 years. So,
That's right.
How did you gather all that information?
First of all, I came in. I'm sort of right in the middle, and so I knew what had happened before me, and knew a lot what was happening, obviously when I was there, and then I did have to do some research on the eras after me. A couple of things. I did interviews. I interviewed all the athletes that were talked about. I did gather all the newspaper articles, largely from the Philadelphia Inquirer and the New York Times, on the Penn Relays. And then I did some research, and then I just through my natural curiosity and connections, and I've been blessed, thanks to my mother, with a great memory. So the guys are always giving me a hard time for the stuff I remember, and I put it all to use here in putting this together. But there's a lot based on personal experience and observation, a lot based on the interviews that I did, then the articles that were written that I researched, and then some more ancillary sources, articles, other books, but always coming back to interviews and confirming and checking things with the people that were actually there.
Wow. So there you were able to get in touch with people from all of these different times.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Are there any stories that you left out of the book, or for brevity, or for I don't know, politically correct purposes that you kind of
that's a
thought
good
about
question.
putting in?
Well, there's lots of stories really of different situations, races that really happened in and around some of the events that I speak about. Just after I graduated, I think in 75, there was a major car crash that really unsettled a couple of the athletes. One of them was a very good freshman when I was there, George McKay. He got banged up quite badly, and that pretty much put an end to his career. It was pretty traumatic for the team. There was another situation where another athlete, they were fooling around in the dorm I lived in, and we lived on the third floor. And it was a night where it was raining, and somebody was wanting to sneak into someone else's room. They came up with the idea of climbing out on the dormer of one room and trying to, crawl over across the eaves to another room. And that person, Greg Ekman, who was a 400-meter runner, who was on a couple of those teams, fell and landed on his arms and his knees and smashed himself up really well. And that was pretty traumatic. But in both those cases, it sort of added to the sort of the commitment of the team looking after each other. It sort of deepened that bond. And when you, Liz, you asked, did I interview all these people? Part of the reason is that we still get together. Like every year we get together at Penn Relays.
That's amazing. So you guys all go down and watch every year.
Yeah. There's a real fraternity, and we actually go on golf tournaments together. Like we've had 3 Irish tours. The number 4 is coming up this June. I'm not sure if I've made 2 of the 3. I'm not sure if we're going to make the one in June. I've typically go to Penn Relays every other year and catch up with everybody, and we tell stories and and just the camaraderie. But I guess that's what this book is really about is the culture and the commitment and the characters and the coaching, which was back to the creative attention, that kind of combination that makes this quite special. Because I don't think there's any school that can talk about the streak of world-class minors that were produced over this period of time.
No. And like, you do mention the camaraderie, like it really comes through in all the stories. What you guys had, it seemed like you guys all had a bond, and every sort of cohort had that same bond. Do you think that same type of bond still happens in teams?
No, it's different. Things have changed, I think, quite substantially. Social media has really changed things, where there's a lot of communications that takes place between coach and athlete through text, and primarily through text. And so you don't have the same sort of collective transfer or receipt of information. I mentioned earlier, one of the key cultural elements of the Villanova team was getting together at the pie shop. Like we would, there were 2 tables in the cafeteria that were the track tables. No one would sit at them. Everybody knew those were the track tables. We had breakfast together, and not all together, but there would be coming and going, but there were track guys moving in and out of that table, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then we got together at the pie shop. So there was that collective gathering that took place 3 or 4 times a day, aside from the workouts that we did together. That doesn't happen anymore. Everybody's much more independent or on their own, or that sort of collective experience that we had, and probably we needed, quite frankly, doesn't take place. People are more self-sufficient. And another big difference, like where I would say the vast majority of people in that era came from sort of working class backgrounds, would not have ever been able to come to that school, Villanova, unless they'd gotten a scholarship. And their focus was really to do as best they could as runners. But Joe made sure we all got our degrees, and we didn't fail when it came to our education. The athlete of today typically comes from, I would say, more of an upper middle class background. They have very clear educational aspirations and career paths. They have the presence of their parents in the background who are either shadowing over them or helicoptering over them. We didn't have any of that. Like when I left home at 17, my parents had took me to the airport, and they had no friggin' clue where I was going.
And they're probably already thinking about sponsors and teams and things like that.
So kids come today, they want to go to this graduate school or this professional program, and they need these sorts of grades, and they don't have the same kind of single-mindedness but that's not to say they aren't good athletes. In fact, if you look at, and you probably know this, the number of kids that break 4 minutes now, it's crazy.
In high school, all the time.
Well, and there was 3 weeks ago in Boston, there was a race, 12 sections of the mile, and 52 guys broke 4 minutes. I mean, incredible. Unbelievable. And when I was in U.S. college, maybe in the entire U.S. system in college, maybe 5 guys break 4 minutes. But, if you got better shoes, you got better tracks. And I did a quick calculation. If you were to improve the group of guys I trained with and lived with, if you were to improve our times by 7 to 8 seconds, which is 3% of a 4-minute mile is 240 seconds, 3% is 7.2 seconds. If you can give everybody a 7% improvement, we would have had 13 guys breaking 4 minutes. So when you hear Washington State having got 5 guys in a race breaking 4 minutes, I says that's pretty fantastic. But if I did the calculation, we could have had 12 or 13 run that fast.
That's incredible.
So at the same time, we had that many guys that running between 4 minutes and 4:08. Things have changed a lot in terms of the type of athlete that comes to the school, the expectations, the connection with the coaches, the role of social media. Training is more nuanced too. It's better, quite frankly. We had a pretty simple approach: just run the miles and do repeat quarters. And we did too much stuff too hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what all of that means is that, performances will improve and records will get beaten by athletes with all these talents, but probably we won't see a streak like this.
No, I don't think you won't see that kind of dominance. And that's what makes this kind of unique. And there was 2 books that inspired me to write this when you asked me earlier why write it. I read first the book called The Boys in the Boat, which is about that rowing team from University of Washington that defied all odds and again, a bunch of working class kids that beat the Eastern establishment rowing and ended up making the Olympic team in 36, and then they beat the Germans in the eights and to win the gold medal. It's an amazing story of perseverance and character. And then the other book I read was written by Kenny Moore called The Men of Oregon. And I read his book and spends a lot of time talking about what happened in Oregon, particularly Bowerman and then Prefontaine and then sort of the early rise of Nike. And I read that book and I thought, our story is every bit as compelling, if not more compelling than this story. So that's kind of got me to say, okay, I got the time and motivation to write something that tells a story of what happened at Villanova.
Once again, Villanova refused to be beaten by Oregon.
Yeah.
Is there a place that you would like to direct listeners to get a copy of the book if they want to read it for themselves? You already mentioned that the proceeds are going to go to
that's right.
Villanova.
The book is available on Amazon. That's probably your best way to source it, either as the book or an ebook.
Okay.
On Kindle. So that would be my best. You just go on Amazon and search the Villanova Track Story, and it will come up.
What if people want to follow you, Jerry, see what you're up to and get copies of your poetry books? And
well, if you just Google Jerry Bouma, Bouma, you'll see poetry books, and you can they're actually online. You can download them free for the taking.
Okay.
I don't have a website per se. Something I need to do. Maybe I'm not.
Especially now that you have more than one book.
That's true. And I'm doing
all that information.
I'm working on a 4th one too.
Oh wow.
Amazon would be the best. My intention is to channel the proceeds back to Villanova. Particularly, I've talked to Marcus O'Sullivan, who's the coach there, about supporting mental health, because I do feel that's such an important part of the mix, and it's one of the areas that was really lacking when I was in school. And I know just having the opportunity just to talk about some of your issues. And when myself, I went through a really tough period because I went in with great aspirations, and then I get this injury, and then you go from not being able to work out and not getting proper treatment for a while to then I had to get orthopedic surgery on my ankle. And then you try to come back too quickly and you keep hurting yourself. And so suddenly 2 years of my athletic life at Villanova, and here I was, in my view, the best program and I could possibly be, and I'm on the sidelines. That's really depressing. And then you got to pick yourself up and build your confidence and come out of that. That's not easy.
And athletes have that extra element because, when they're not performing, I mean, not that being away from home and all that isn't difficult, but, now you're also far from home and trying to, adjust to school life in a new school. But then you also have the added pressure of you're on scholarship for
right. You're there to perform. You're there.
Yeah.
You're not. This is not. You're not there just because you're a nice person. You're there because you're expected to contribute to a
Hmm.
program and be part of a
Yeah.
program. Another real interesting story, Alan and Liz, and you may have read this, is one of I would consider my closest friend, John Hartnett, who came from County Cork. We both arrived at the same time, and we were the only two dairy farm boys on campus. They're like, upper middle class America doesn't know what farming is. Here we come. He's a farm boy from County Cork, parents of dairy farmers. I'm a farm boy from Ontario, parents of dairy farmers. And of course, we connected right away. But little did anybody know that John, he had just turned 19. He'd been out of school for 4 years. He didn't even finish high school.
Oh, wow.
His father died when he was 12, and he had to, in exchange for an uncle looking after their farm, the commitment was made that John would work for the uncle at the age of 15. So he left school at 15. So he spent 4 years basically as a farm helper. And it was only because of track or running, his ability to run, he had the opportunity to go to Villanova. He was a very good runner. But here he is. Now imagine, here's a 19-year-old kid, hasn't been in school for 4 years, going to America, the land of opportunity, going to a high-end school, and he hasn't been in school since he's been 15. Can you imagine how scared he was?
Yeah.
No one knew. He suffered through this on his own. He got through it because he's bright and motivated. But another example of the kind of adjustment that is taking place unwittingly. And this is where I think counseling and support and mental health and those sorts of things. Because we had another kid from Ireland that came over from Dublin. He was a really good kid, but very hypersensitive. And he came over with Eamon Coughlin, just as good as Eamon. And Eamon was thriving because he was kind of a street kid and he liked to mix it up. And the tougher things got, the better Eamon liked it. But this other kid, the tougher things got, the more he started to withdraw. And by the time, February, March came around, he was a wreck psychologically and just left.
That's too bad.
Yeah, because there are no systems to help him, basically.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a pretty good, let's say, objective for your book and your book sales. So we hope we push you along a little bit with this.
Yeah. May I close by saying, well, this is about track. It isn't really about track. It's about life. It's about character. It's about culture. It's about commitment. It's about team. It's about really taking advantage of opportunity and persevering. And what can happen when you put together a group of talented individuals in the right kind of environment with the right kind of cultural support, with a bit of tension and aspiring to become the best in the world. And this is what happens. And that's the Villanova Track Story. World-class excellence, year in, year out, for year after year.
Yeah, and I think we found it to be that as well. We didn't know coming in, but so let's give you our potted summary. If you're a younger reader and you look at the cover of the book, it might not attract you so much because it's got sort of an older story. It's a historical book, but it's got an older photograph on it. But what I would say is you might want to give it a try because some of the content within the book is truly inspirational. The challenges faced by overseas scholarship runners was incredible. We've just talked about that. Very strange circumstances for people with no social connectivity. You can't email home or even text or whatever. You're on your own and you're in a vastly different place. And that's even before you start trying to run and perform or not. I also found that it was fascinating to see some of the American history placed in context with running. And the example I've got here is, Villanova boycotting a meet at New York Athletics Club in 1968 because they had a no blacks policy, and we touched on that. There are some nice black and white photographs in the book. We didn't mention that, but there's actually, you can see, I think, all the heroes at the height of their powers, photographs of them, and also many of the heroes at a more present day, reunions and things like that, which is pretty cool. You also mentioned at the start that Jerry has published poetry books, and there's a very nice poem right at the back called Twice as Hard, Half as Fast. And I actually enjoyed that rather well. It's a running related poem, and I think don't forget to turn right to the back of the book when you read it, otherwise you'll miss that poem. All in all, a surprising and very enjoyable read.
So I guess I'll just echo Alan's first point, because Alan and I brought our books on a recent group running trip where we shared an Airbnb with several other teammates. And when they saw the book cover, the comment we got was, "That looks like a history textbook." I'll start by saying that it is a history book, but it's one of those don't judge the book by its cover kind of situations, because it reads much better than a history book. And like, history class was actually my least favorite subject in high school, and I really, really liked this book. So I think that says something. The book is well referenced, but reads like a story. You really feel like you get to know the personalities of the athletes in the book. They're really like characters. How they came together from different parts of the world it's really a testament to, as human beings. I mean, we're all human, and we all can have the same feelings and worries, and we can bond over that. One of the things that is impressive is how well Coach Jumbo Elliott seemed to know his athletes. Despite his lack of presence, he would basically just show up once the warm-up was done to supervise the workouts. But then he would pick the winning teams all the time. I also found the portion about the Sydney Murray era interesting. It describes how damaging apartheid was for Blacks in South Africa, and I felt sad for Sydney because he wasn't able to bond with his teammates at Villanova the way the other athletes did. I think anyone who likes track and field history, or just likes to read true stories, would love this book. There are several athletes who became really big names on the world stage featured in the book, like Marty Licory and Eamon Coghlan, who we've mentioned during the podcast. So all in all, a fantastic book.
I'd just like to thank you once again, Jerry, for your time.
Thank you for your interest.
It was really a pleasure.
And thanks for the creativity you bring to a sport that needs a bit of a boost now and then, because it kind of gets forgotten. But it is a true essence of the human spirit, the ability to run fast and to get up for competition and to compete and compete in a noble way.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Running Book Reviews. A big thank you to Jerry for providing review copies of the book and spending time with us today. If you'd like to leave us feedback about how we can improve the podcast, or want to suggest a book that you'd like us to review in a future episode, please leave us a message on social media. We are Running Book Reviews on Facebook and Instagram, and on Twitter we are reviews_running. Please also follow us on social media to find out about new episodes when they are released, or you can simply subscribe to the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. If you've been listening for a while and you're wondering how you can help us out, there are a few ways, as per usual. If you're enjoying the podcast, spread the word. Tell your friends, share a link, get your running partners to listen to our podcast. Or you can leave us a review on Apple Podcast, if this is how you listen, or you can rate us out of 5 stars on Spotify. We're also now on Buy Me a Coffee, where you can go and listen to a few outtakes and different discussions about running. And also, if you feel free to do so, you can buy us a coffee. That's all today from Running Book Reviews. Bye for now.
Bye.